Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Tony Douglas. I help lead the Decentralization Research Center, and we are thrilled and very honored to have Chris Giancarlo as our first guest in what will be a series of leaders talking about decentralization, policymakers, researchers, and practitioners. So Chris, thank you for joining us.
Tony, it's great to be with you.
So much of our audience would probably be familiar with your background, but I'll give one in brief before we jump in. So Chris has spent nearly 4 decades now in financial services, both in the public and private sector. He led GFI Global to become a leading brokerage services company, also leading them to go public, served in various capacities, both as executive vice president and then later on the board. You went on to become the chairman of the CFTC, where during your tenure from 2014 to 2019, I'm sure you did a ton of things, but as it relates to this topic, oversaw the entry of Bitcoin futures products into the market. And more recently, do a number of things, public works. I believe I've heard you frame it as relating all to basically digitizing the financial system. Because I was reading I don't know how you find the time, but advisor, board member, leader in various capacities to a lot of different projects. And it was interesting hearing you frame the through line to those projects in that way. And perhaps most notably, a co-founder of the Digital Dollar Project.
Yeah, thank you, Tony.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. So actually, I want to start there with the Digital Dollar Project. We would love to hear about basically how you would describe it, what is the mission, and why is it important to you?
Yeah, thank you so much. The purpose of the Digital Dollar Project is to explore how do we best future-proof the US dollar and most importantly its reserve currency status as we go into a future where value is increasingly moving into distributed networks, some of which are truly decentralized, others of which are centralized, and of the centralized ones, some of those will be run by governments, and others will be run by private sector actors. Many of them will have a reference point to the dollar, and the question for us is the role that the dollar has played in the post-war period, especially the last 30 years of globalization, has been one that's been beneficial not just to America, and it's certainly been beneficial to American citizens, but has been beneficial to the whole world, I would argue, on balance, with some drawbacks, but it's certainly been the reference point on which a 30-year period of globalization has taken place, having a stable value reference point. The question is, will it continue to play that role in this new future where value increasingly moves on digital networks? And that's the question, and that's the role of the Digital Dollar Project. In my book, Crypto Dad, I refer to this jokingly as money is too important to be left to central bankers. And I mean that with no disrespect to central bankers, but I mean that it harkens back to a statement that French Premier Clemenceau made at the end of World War I. Looking at the carnage of the war, he said, you know what, maybe war is too important to be left entirely to the generals. And I think the same is true about money. You know, money is as much a social construct as it's a government construct. Without the support, especially with fiat money, without the support of the populace, money is worthless. And so the US government really needs the private sector to step up and engage and talk about what is the role for the dollar. And that's the role for the Digital Dollar Project, to bring the private sector's point of view and the values of a free society to bear on the evolution of the dollar into this new digital future.
Yeah, really cool. And on the question of why is it important to you, more so from like a personal, you have any number of ways you could spend your time. Again, 40 years of service, you could retire and, probably live a pretty easy, restful life. Why use your time this way?
Yeah, I guess it's kind of, we talk a lot about giving back, and I've certainly been the beneficiary of the late 20th century American economy, early 21st century, this period of globalization. My career benefited from commerce across the globe. At GFI Group, a firm that I helped grow and take public in the early 2000s, I saw the power that the dollar plays in the global environment, and I think I saw the important role that it plays. And as I think about this digital future that I have every certainty is coming, I say coming whether we like it or not, whether we want it or not, it's coming. It's my way of giving back to help create a forum where the private sector can debate, can discuss, can raise concerns, and most importantly, bring the values of a free society to bear as we shape the future and the role of the dollar in that future.
Yeah. I want to ask more a question related to the average American as it pertains to the Digital Dollar Project, but I first want to share the spirit of the question. So at the DRC, a big part of our mission is basically to share the knowledge about these technologies, also to give people an opportunity to have more of a voice and participate in the design and governance of these systems that are being built. So that's one reason. The second reason is I grew up in a blue-collar family, and I don't know if I should admit this on camera, but I think it's important for our audience to know this. Despite my professional background in financial services and going to business school twice, et cetera, it wasn't until a few years ago that I even appreciated, some of the points that you're making and why it's important that we're reserve currency and the role that the Fed plays in U.S. debt markets and just the macro economy overall. I had no appreciation for what any of this meant. So I would have, 4 years ago, heard what you said and not necessarily known. I guess at the time I was 27. Like, why should I care? And not just like, why should I listen to this person? Like, why should I participate in the discussion? Talk to my representatives about it, et cetera.
Right. So we share something in common because I'm the grandson of a bricklayer who is an immigrant from southern Italy to the United States. And people that immigrated here immigrated for a whole bunch of reasons. They certainly immigrated for economic opportunity, but they also immigrated because they were attracted to a series of values of social participation in the political process, of limited government, but a government that played an important role, but still limited in terms of its engagement in the economy, where free enterprise. One could go out, as my grandfather did, and start as a bricklayer working for a larger company, eventually went out with a partner and started on his own and grew it into a reasonably small, nice-sized small business. Never got too big, but big enough to send his only son to school and eventually to medical school, and a career that enabled me to go even further than my father and my grandfather, which is the American dream, is it not? And those values that they were attracted to are also expressed in the currency we use. The notion that you can engage in economic transactions free from surveillance, free from censorship, and most importantly, at least for most of America's history, free from reckless, profligate printing of money and rampant inflation that so many countries are guilty of, robbing their citizens of stable value and ability to save for their retirement. And so when I think about the US dollar, I think it's represented the very values that brought my ancestors to this country, and I think many other ancestors to this country, not just to come to this country, but to contribute to its growth. So when I think about the future, I think about those very same values. How do we do it? And I think if we bring those values to the future of money, to both stable coins, any future central bank digital currency, we will bring that same attractiveness to our way of life and to our economy that attracted our ancestors. If we get it wrong, then we're no better than some other jurisdictions in the world that use their currency to enslave their people. So to me, the whole debate about the future of money is, what values are we going to encode in it? People talk a lot about the value of one currency from the other. In the future, it may very well be the values that attract people to use one currency. And the more people are drawn to that currency, the stronger, the higher its value is.
Yeah, absolutely. That transitions me to my next question quite nicely. So, I alluded to this earlier, but again, at the DRC, what we really care about and we're concerned about is that there's broad participation, broad ownership and governance around emerging technologies. The U.S. CBDC is one example of that. There are many others. AI, blockchain, quantum computing, etc. But I thought what was quite beautiful about the way you expressed that and why people should care is that it paints a version of the future, which I guess in my belief, I'm not a historian, sort of brings us back to our roots as Americans, and I think a time where there were a lot of people participating in the shape of different constructs that influence society. Which brings me to the question of what is the risk of not finding ourselves there again, where maybe we're in a world where these things are governed, designed, et cetera, by just a small group of people in a boardroom or congressional hearings, et cetera, that are really defining the future rather than this like broad participation.
So the first wave of the internet was not planned, but it was some glorious Cambrian explosion of both the public sector and the private sector building it into what it's today. And a lot of that development, not all of it, but a lot of it took place here in the United States. And they brought to it, I would say, democratic values of openness. The internet as we know it is an open program. Anybody can participate in it. It's not run out of Washington. It's decentralized. And yet there are commercial applications built upon it. I think that should be the model of this next wave of the internet, this internet of value. There's no reason why that same, glorious confusion of explosion of innovation shouldn't take place here too. There is absolutely a role for the official sector in getting money right. Going back to ancient Mesopotamia and certainly the Roman Empire, it's Caesar's head that's on the coin. There is always a role for public money. And I would argue that in a free market economic system, there's an important role for sovereign currency that make all the other systems of value work. Would people put their money in the bank if in a crisis they couldn't run down to the ATM and take it out? And yet 90% of the money in the world today is bank money. Certainly in our established economies, it's bank money. And yet 10% is cash. And yet the cash makes the whole 90% work. So I would argue that it'd be foolish for us not to explore all, in a new digital future, all digital network means of value storage and value transfer. Let's just take this one step further. Let's just go back to sort of an imagined analog world of the last century. One could store and transfer value, almost in a hierarchy from simple goods like an automobile to, say, a little bit more rarefied, like maybe a classic automobile or artwork. And from there to commodities like gold and silver, and from there to maybe simple bank accounts or prepaid debit cards or merchant cards, all the way up to the actual cash that enjoys the full faith and credit of a government, right? Well, why would we not expect the same hierarchy of choice in a new digital future? Digital artworks, NFTs, digital commodities, such as maybe Bitcoin, certainly my agency considers it a matter of law to be a digital commodity. Bank accounts, put money in banks so they can pay interest, so they can do fractional banking and money creation. Prepaid merchant cards or money market funds in the form of some sort of commercially issued stablecoin. And then ultimately central bank digital currency. And that value will move in and out of those various components as it always does in an economy based on economic conditions, based upon one's own resources. And yet in a crisis, all those value elements flow to sovereign money, or go in that direction, not exclusively, but go in that direction. So I can imagine a future that digitally looks very much like the past. And I think that our rights are best assured the more choice there is, which is why I have to say I'm somewhat perplexed when I hear otherwise very digitally astute people saying we should have one or the other. I mean, please don't restrict my choice in a digital future. You might want to restrict your own choice, but I think the digital future should have all of the above. And I think that, to go back to your original question, I think it's the role of the private sector to innovate, bring out more and more distributed ledger systems. I left out kind of decentralized networks. I think decentralized networks have a very important role to play. If nothing else, they may keep profligate governments honest. I think Bitcoin must and should have an important future, and I only use it as a proxy for other decentralized commodity-based systems, but I think it should have an important future. And already we're seeing that closed society governments that want to preference their CBDC, such as China, are looking to squelch utilization of decentralized networks in their own country. Hopefully that's not the course we pursue in our free society, which brings me back to answer my question. I hope that this evolution of digital forms of value mimics the evolution of an Internet of Information by being just a colossal Cambrian explosion of both official sector and private sector innovation.
Yeah, this where you ended there reminds me of a quote from a recent speech that you were giving, where you basically said the development of a U.S. CBDC provides an opportunity to effectively address this risk that's present for centralized large-scale platforms with respect to people's individual privacy.
I'm so glad you did.
So I guess on that point,
yeah.
And you were going to jump right there.
But finish your point.
I was just going to say we'd love for you to sort of comment on that quote, where it came from and what the risks are.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that, because sometimes people that are opposed to a CBDC take the position, just say no, let's not have a CBDC, as if we live in a system right now where privacy is sacrosanct. It's not. As I pointed out, and I think you're referring to an article I wrote in the American Enterprise Institute with scholar Jim Harper, where we pointed out that the current system of bank account-based value transmission is anything but private. It is heavily surveilled, and from time to time it's censored by government. And so we argue together in that article that the prospect of exploring a US CBDC is an opportunity for us to kind of get our mojo back as a society about what we expect in terms of our fundamental Bill of Rights freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, and most importantly, expectation of personal privacy for lawful activity. And I think the discussion around CBDC is an opportunity for us to reconsider that. We certainly don't want to follow the China model of central bank digital currency, what they call their ECNY, which is a very sophisticated design, but it does incorporate very strong elements of surveillance and censorship to accord with China's social credit system. That's absolutely what we don't want to do in the United States. But the presumption that we would is kind of an insult to us as free people. Why would we go that way? In fact, I think that left to our own devices, we'll do what we did in the first wave of the internet and design something that is the freedom coin of the future, something that protects privacy. And if we, the public, we, the people, engage in that debate and let our representatives in Washington know that freedom, economic freedom, is our expectation, and if we get the design right, I think we can preserve the dollar as the world's coin to have, currency to have for generations more to come. And that's what we should be doing as a free people, and reject this presumption that we would do anything otherwise.
I think it's such an important point. I again reflect on, I guess, previous version of Tony that had no appreciation for how technology was built, anything about how the economy worked, et cetera. And
you keep selling yourself short, Tony. I don't believe you for a minute.
No, I mean it. And where I sit today, like that version of Tony before, again, would have listened and said, okay, well, I'm a little bit bought in. If I'm like following the trajectory of our discussion here, I'm getting increasingly bought in. But even if I were to care and talk to local representatives, or just talk to my friends, or build technology, or just, I don't know, just participate in some form or fashion, it's not going to matter, right? At the end of the day, we sit in a time where there's just a ton of distrust in our governments, in the folks that lead corporations, et cetera. So I guess my question is, like, in the rooms you've been in, the seats you've sat in, what do you think the responsibility of people, prominent regulators, policymakers, et cetera, is with engaging a younger generation that is really going to live with this? And vice versa, for that younger generation, how can you meaningfully engage with those folks?
Yeah. So I think that younger Tony was not as perhaps naive as you think. He was right to be distrustful of politicians designing digital currency. And when you look around the world, whether it's China or even in Europe, there's a deferral by the citizenry to the government to design either the ECNY or the digital euro. And what I'm actually heartened by and actually proud of here in the United States is the private sector is not waiting for government. The innovation is ongoing. I mean, I tip my hat to Circle. I tip my hat to PayPal. I tip my hat to the builders of decentralized layer ones that are innovating. That's the way we roll in this country, and that's the absolute right thing to do. And we should continue that. The old adage of don't ask permission, ask forgiveness, the spirit of that was right. Now, what's different about this wave of the internet than the earlier wave, when an earlier wave of the internet, an internet of information, rolled out of Silicon Valley and covered the Great Plains and rolled into Washington, there were no government agencies in Washington whose job it was to maintain the status quo of information sharing. Right. There's no ministry of truth, no ministry of commercial development on the internet. And nor were there any in state capitals. And so the first wave of the internet did not encounter any built-in institutional resistance. Well, this wave of the internet, we've long presumed in our democratic societies a role for government in protecting people's accounts on deposit with banks, protecting people's accounts on deposit with trustees, and more important, and equally, protecting people's activities in marketplaces to free them from fraud and manipulation. So in this wave of the internet, not really originating in Silicon Valley as much as the earlier one, rolled out of Brooklyn or rolled out of Chicago into the limestone halls of Washington, it ran smack into not one, not two, but three bank regulators. Not one, but two market regulators. And it rolled into the same thing in every state capital for banking regulators and in many state capitals for market regulators. And those regulators have a mission to protect consumers, protect investors, but to some degree have a degree of capture by their industries, and their mission is to protect status quos. And so this wave of the internet is encountering more institutional resistance. And it's also encountering, I think, generational resistance. A generation that did not grow up in a networked era are struggling to understand that the internet is now doing to banking and finance and money itself what it's already done to social networking, to retail shopping, to art, transportation, photography. And I think some of that generation mixes up the desire for financial stability with protecting the status quo. And if you look at history, anytime you defend the status quo, all you do is find the status quo is washed away from under you. It's like King Canute demanding that the ocean not rise and the tide not wave in, and in fact it does anyway. This technology is going to come whether the septuagenarian generation want it to happen or not. And I don't mean to be insultful, I just mean we do have a generational gap here. We also have institutional opposition to this. Having said all of that, it's going to happen anyway. This technological change is going to move. Value is going to increasingly move away from stored on the balance sheets of commercial institutions, whether they be banks or brokerage firms, and increasingly move onto a both permissioned and unpermissioned, distributed or decentralized, and in some cases centralized, systems of value. And that is going to be greatly transformative. And I think the next generation that's behind this current generation of leaderships will more intuitively understand this and will be more open to it. So this wave of the internet is coming, as I said, whether we like it or not. And ultimately, the real question is whether we step forward and condition it, whether we step forward and make sure the values that got us here are the ones that survive. I honestly don't really care whether old institutions survive or not. I don't care whether old formats dissolve. What really matters is whether the core values survive into this new digital future.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to pivot slightly, but I think it's a tangent, and talk a little bit about AI and some of the risks that are presented by different waves of AI. So obviously, we've seen in previous elections that AI models basically facilitated disinformation. In recent forms of AI, you can see generative text and really changing, really being very human-like in the way that you can generate text and emails, spam emails, et cetera. And even deep fakes that people can present as someone else and sort of steal their identity, if you will. Do you feel like that there's a concern for regulators and policymakers for their constituents, like even in communication? Can they trust that communication, and how do they generally think about it?
So I think your premise is a good one. I think AI is going to be incredibly challenging for both the financial service industry and for regulators. I don't know exactly what the antidote to that initial shock of that technology hitting the marketplace is going to be, but I do know, like in most waves, eventually we will come to grips with it and figure it out. I think the initial impact of it is going to be hard. And it's going to be very hard for regulators. Regulators rely on, for just one example, regulators rely on regulated entities to provide them with a lot of information as to how they understand the market. When I boil it down, I think one of the anecdotes is going to have to be, we're going to have to really get our head around identity. And identity has been an area where the United States has traditionally struggled. The notion, of a free and open society, a place where people can make mistakes and reemerge, of a sort of an open frontier, has made the American people much less comfortable with a national identity system as compared to, say, Europe, for example, and or in closed societies where identity is closely followed. We use proxies for identity, social security numbers and driver's license, that were never meant to serve this purpose. So I think one area where we're going to have to respond to the challenge of AI is to think through a validating identity system that's both respectful of people's personal integrity and their personal freedom of activity and economic activity, and yet satisfies the needs for verifying inputs into the financial system, into social media, and all the other areas. You mentioned all those areas, but if you can track back comments to the actual maker of them, then we may have some relief from robots and other, not relief, but we may be able to separate what's true from what's not true by being able to track statements back to the true identity of people. So I think identity plays a big role in the response to AI in the market.
Yeah, it's very interesting you say that for a couple of reasons. So we have folks within the DRC network that are writing about blockchain being a potential antidote to issues with identity with respect to AI and such. And also, recently I was at Stanford and leading the blockchain club. We had an accelerator of a lot of young kids building solutions, basically let's just say using blockchain for good. But I think I found over time they were actively somewhat discouraged from pursuing those as ventures because of the uncertainty with regulation and et cetera. So it kind of brings me back to your point on look, this is an unstoppable wave because it is, and in recognition that technology as a tool can be used for good or bad. How can, again, I don't want to keep bringing it to regulators and put it on them, but how can we change the landscape so that that 18, 19, 20-year-old kid that wants to use this tool for good isn't discouraged from doing so?
These are hard things. There's nothing easy about this. I'll fight to the death for the right of free people to enjoy anonymity in economic transactions. I would argue that our vaunted freedoms of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly are nothing if there's no economic freedom. Because what is freedom of assembly other than dues you pay to an organization you wish to belong to? What is freedom of speech other than subscriptions you paid to read the magazines you wish to read? And if you don't have economic freedom, then you don't have freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. And so we've got, and some of that comes down to identity. The right to engage in economic activity anonymously needs to be preserved, but that doesn't mean it should be an opening for law breaking, right? And so we've got to find that balance between, and I think the balance is going to lie in allowing regulators to be able to surveil activity, but on an anonymous basis.
Right.
And while that may be to some that, they get nervous about that, we do that every day in highway law enforcement. If you think about it, you don't have to give up your identity at the toll booth to get on the highway.
Right.
You proceed on the highway, but then law enforcement uses pattern recognition. If you're speeding, if you're reckless driving, if you're driving with your headlights off after dark, that is an indication of perhaps probable cause of law breaking, at which point law enforcement then can interdict the activity and gain identity. It's identity last. It's identity when there's probable cause of something being done wrong, as opposed to identity in case somebody might do something wrong.
Yeah.
We need to get to a system, I think, and I think distributed ledgers perhaps provide this opportunity, where regulators can be nodes on blockchains, where they can see all the activity on an anonymous basis, and only as and when there is probable cause of law breaking can they interdict that and then perhaps gain identity. But it's complicated, and AI adds another layer of complication because there could be deliberate false flags put into that to harm the system, to harm another person, and we need to think about how do we separate that. And I think we're going to have to think through in a more mature fashion, in a more nuanced fashion, a more sophisticated fashion, and in a fashion that respects our core principles. How do we address the issue of identity in a world in which we're increasingly going to have artificial participants in our markets, in our financial system, alongside real participants, and we're going to have to separate one from the other.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to wrap up with one question. Well, I have to say very quickly, the irony is not lost on me again in this comparison that you created. That let's say I'm at a toll booth and the camera's taking it. I do trust that no one's stealing my identity, etc. But I can't verify that. But in the system that you sort of I guess.
Well, I'm so glad you asked that because trust is going to have to be built in a digital future, not because a government institution says trust us.
Yeah.
What we've seen the last 20 years is the American people's confidence in their institution continues to drop, and I don't think it's going to work to have governments say trust us, we're not surveilling you.
Right.
The systems that emerge, and certainly any central bank digital currency system that emerges, is going to have to be operationally transparent, so that people themselves can verify that they're not being unlawfully surveilled and not being unlawfully censored. And even if they don't have the technical proficiency, there will be journals, there'll be independents out there that will say they've got in the code, read the code, and the code doesn't allow government to surveil you. And by the same way, it applies to stablecoins. I mean, are we going to rely on stablecoin operators to tell us that they're not selling the data, that they're not surveilling us, that they're not being told by politicians to ban this activity or ban that activity? So I think the same concern, whenever you have a centralized system, whether that's a stablecoin or CBDC, the same concerns apply, which is why I'm such a fan of decentralized systems, because that keeps all the centralized systems honest.
Yeah, it's a great way to put it. Okay, I promise this is the last question. And we'll end on a bit of a lighter note. So I don't spend a ton of time with people that have your background, that have spent so much time in public service and influenced so much about the economic system that I sort of operate within. But my impression, could be naive, is that if I were to sit down with many of them, I couldn't have a discussion in as conversant, technology conversant a way where they're intimately aware of how these things are evolving, et cetera. What brought you here? How did you arrive at this point where you do care about these things and you want to spend your time, again, to the earlier question, in this way?
I think that if you come out of the American experience, you realize how fortunate you are. You realize how rare in human history has been democracy. I mean, if human history is a day, the amount of time humans have spent in democratic systems of government is a couple of minutes. Throughout most of human history, most people lived in a degree of slavery or servitude of one form or the other, serfdom. And again, I cited my background, and my people were European peasants. They probably worked fields where they were not allowed to leave their village for centuries under the system of serfdom. And so to have the blessings of a written constitution that prescribes government's activities to constrain our liberty it seems the natural thing to do, having benefited in 40 years from the system, to be out there advocating that we've got to get it right for the next generations, for my kids and my grandkids, for yours and your grandkids. That we're going to a new technological era, and it can either enslave us or it can free us. It can either diminish our individual worth, integrity as individuals, or it can open up to a whole new vista of aspiration. We've got to make sure it's those secondary things. And I've had great fortune in life, so I'm here to kind of pay back by advocating that we take these actions.
What a beautiful note to end on. Chris, thank you again.
Thank you, Tony.